Blender 5.2 LTS has just been released, and it includes some incredible new features as well as some welcome quality enhancements that are going to help you work even faster. I'm Jonathan Lampel with cgcookie.com, and in this video, we're going to cover everything that's new in Blender 5.2 LTS. One of the first add-ons that you might have heard about when watching modeling tutorials is the classic loop tools. They have become so ubiquitous over the years and are finally being built into Blender itself. Not only does this mean you don't have to install an extension to get them, they also are significantly faster now since they are rewritten in C and the UIs have been modernized. The ones that made it into 5.2 are Circle, Space Evenly, and Flatten. The others will be coming later. In the snapping department, you can now snap to lattice objects. The Array modifier, the newer Geometry Nodes one, got more user-friendly alignment options. Selection now respects the viewport's backface culling option, which makes it easier to work with interior geometry. 3D text objects now support complex characters that have above and below font instructions. In the UV editor, you can now delimit by seams, sharp edges, or material boundaries when selecting linked. The copy mirrored UV coordinates operator now works on any axis. A new select by winding operator helps to isolate flipped UVs. Select overlapped now works for the whole island in island selection mode. You can now unwrap islands to their original bounds so they don't jump up and take the entire UV space every time you unwrap. You can now add snap points when setting the snap base in the UV editor, which snaps to the average between all of the points, just like in the 3D view. A brand new sculpting brush, Scene Project, allows you to shrink wrap geometry to the surface of other objects in the scene. The Add Primitive tools are now available directly in Sculpt mode. The Color Filter Tools Fill mode got an upgrade. You can now click to apply the current color, click drag to blend with the current color, hold Ctrl to swap to the secondary color, and you can use Ctrl X to perform a fill from any tool. If you enable dynamic topology and switch back and forth between Sculpt mode, you no longer have to confirm to go back to using dynamic topology every time. The Voxel Remesher better interpolates attributes like vertex colors now. Vertex and weight paint modes now use a 3D brush just like Sculpt mode. The Brush Advanced section is now a nicely organized panel. And when texture painting, the altered image is now included in Blender's autosave, which I think is going to save a lot of keyboards and tablets from being smashed.
Hello everyone, this is Cartesian Caramel covering the geometry node changes for Blender 5.2. This is a big update with many features, so let's get started. This release comes with a new physics system focusing on hair and cloth. Two new modifiers powered by the new XBBD solver node have been added, Cloth Dynamics and Hair Dynamics. These are generalized systems that allow for custom forces. While they are still experimental, users are recommended to try them and give feedback for future releases. Bundles can now be attached to geometry, allowing for arbitrary data to be passed across modifier and object boundaries, using the new setGeometry bundle and getGeometry bundle nodes. Data attached to geometry can be seen in the spreadsheet. Lists are a new core data type that allows storing a sequence of arbitrary data and come with several new nodes. Field2List creates a new list by evaluating index-dependent fields. Closure2List creates a new list by evaluating a closure that has an index input. ListLength outputs the length of a list. GetListItem outputs an individual item. FilterList creates a new list if a boolean is true or false. SortList sorts based on a custom weight. The new CollectionChildren node uses lists to output the child objects and collections of a given collection with an option for recursion. A new sound socket type has been added. This is used by the new Sample Sound Frequencies node, which uses an imported sound to output the amplitude as a float. It can also sample frequency ranges, which allows for creating sound spectrum animations. Empty objects can now have geometry nodes. This is useful for effects that don't require original data, and this also allows geometry nodes to be used on collection instances. The building blocks of the Merge by Distance node are now available individually as 3 new nodes. Merge Points combines point or mesh vertices with the same group ID, Cluster by Distance creates group IDs for close points, and Cluster by Connected creates group IDs for close vertices connected by edges. The new Mesh Bevel node has been added. It is similar to the Bevel modifier and provides more detailed control. Attributes have 3 new nodes. Rename attribute allows renaming a single attribute or all attributes with a specific prefix. Get attribute names outputs a list of the names of attributes in a geometry, optionally filtered by domain and data type. Transfer attribute can transfer an arbitrary number of attributes from one geometry to another. The capture attribute node now supports selection. This improves efficiency when an attribute value is only required by a subset of elements. Attributes can now be stored as 4D float vectors, though geometry node still only operates on 3D vectors. Curves have two new nodes. SetNurb's order controls how many curve points influence each evaluated point, and SetNurb's weight controls the influence of each control point. Strings have four new nodes. Trim string removes specific characters at the start or end. Reverse string reverses the order of the characters. Split string splits text into a list based on a delimiter, and set string case turns strings into upper or lower case. The value to string and string to value nodes now have a base input which specifies the number system used when converting to and from integers. The find in string node can now find the first occurrence from the end. String fields are now supported, but keep in mind string attributes are not yet implemented. The default for a node group input can now be the scene frame or self object. 6 new bundled assets have been added. 3D to screen space transforms 3D coordinates from world to normalized camera space. Screen to 3D space is the inverse of this. Transform and project computes 2D coordinates in screen space. Project with depth transforms coordinates from the viewport 3D space to screen space and back. Principal components analyzes a position vector field, and geometry principal components analyzes on a specific input geometry. In miscellaneous updates, the new instance reference node outputs the internal attribute which shows what geometry set index each instance is referencing. The new getGeometryComponent node extracts a single component of a geometry. The compare node now supports comparing data blocks. The boneInfo node now has an exists output, and the viewer node can show data block names. Lastly, closures can now be called recursively up to a limit. A new call stack depth limit for geometry nodes can be configured in the user preferences. Node tool inputs are remembered between operator invocations and can now be assigned in Python. Internal fields are now deduplicated for evaluation. This can speed up nodes that are used multiple times, like sample UV surface. Sampling nodes have improved performance when they can avoid conversions to the face corner domain. That was a lot of condensed information, but you should be able to learn it before the next release. I hope you all enjoyed this overview of the changes and additions to geometry nodes in Blender 5.2.
The improvements to Grease Pencil keep coming, and for the long-term release, some long-awaited features have finally made it in. Let's begin in Draw mode, where the most obvious changes are to brush and stroke handling. The thumbnails for brushes have been updated, and when you enable online access after install, a texture brush pack becomes automatically available, although you will have to download the brush locally before using it. Now, this isn't a big issue. Just hover your cursor over the brush, you'll see this little download icon, and by clicking on it, it will download and you're ready to draw. Before you even put stylus to tablet, you can set the stroke curve type. This is found under the stroke post-processing brush settings. The threshold sets a distance between the generated points, so this is really good for generating strokes with minimal information. The point handling becomes active once you're in edit mode. Improvements to alpha handling for dot and square line types mean that brushes like the airbrush look a lot better. Speaking of dot line types, a new placement feature now gives you control on how the dots are distributed along a stroke. These are editable at the material level and comprise of 3 ways dots can be distributed: count, radius, and density. The difference is that count generates dots between points. Radius distributes the dots based on a percentage of the brush radius, and density distributes the dots along the entire stroke. This is especially good for textured strokes. You can also now randomize some of the parameters such as size, strength, and rotation at the material level. While base color and transparency controls for a material's stroke or fill still exist, these two settings can now be overridden in draw mode. You'll already be familiar with the color attribute setting, allowing you to choose from a color wheel or palette and completely override the material color. But you can now also switch between stroke, fill, or both modes for a material on the go. This will speed up your workflow dramatically. The fill tool now has a new solver called Delaunay, which generates geometry based on the boundaries it is trying to fill in. It can automatically detect gaps, so now you can fill those donuts with ease. You may have noticed that the eraser function is now gone from your brush settings. Now, whatever your last eraser tool was set to is used. You can hold down Control while drawing to toggle between draw and erase. The Line Art tool now supports fills. Now, admittedly, this is best for more primitive objects or planar faces. Finally, there are some minor but useful functions to improve your workflow. In edit mode, Shift-L now deselects strokes that are completely selected. The Move to Layer function now shows any groups and sublayers. And Vertex Mode Color Attribute Replacement now has blend modes. And Stroke Mode is also available, allowing you to affect just the strokes, fills, or both.
I'm Wayne Dixon from CG Cookie, and the next couple of minutes I'm going to inform you about the rigging and the animation updates in this release. There's some nice quality of life improvements, including some that they let me sneak in there. Let's go. When spawning bones with Shift A, you now have more options for your new bone. Just open up the redo panel and you can see it's actually useful. Previously, all you could do was set the bone name, but now you can disable the deform option. That's perfect for control bones. You can also set the bone's length. That's awesome. And the B-bone size also scales with this length value, so you won't get any nasty surprises. We'll see that in a moment. Plus, you also have options for the coordinate space it's going to spawn in. That's either going to be world space or object space. But most of the time, they should be exactly the same. But here's the big awesome stuff. In the alignment, you have some very useful settings. The default alignment is object up, just as it's always been. But you can now align it to the cursor or the viewport. But the best addition by far is for those of you, like myself, who like to world align your control bones. Just choose Object Axes and boom. Look at that. World align controls in a single step. What are you going to do with all the time you're going to save? And because the spawn bone length is now linked to the B-bone size, there's no surprises when you jump over into B-bone mode. No more of this. Oh boy. It's now easier to copy object constraints from one object to another, as it's been added to the Control L menu. What do you reckon of that, Suzanne? Is that easier? The Suzannes say yes. When parenting an object to a bone, there's now a new slider that will let you set the position along that bone. It will default to the tail, which might seem like an odd choice, but this is for backwards compatibility, and it's currently going to work exactly the same as it used to. But now you can position that object anywhere along the bone length. And before you ask, no, it doesn't include the bendy bone position, it's just that straight bone. There is a new duplicate and rename operator, which is up here in the armature menu. This will let you duplicate the selected bones and rename them in a single operation. Here I want to duplicate these bones to become control bones, so I can use this to find the DEF and replace it with nothing. Ta-da! This search and rename happens before the name collision is detected, so this is one way of avoiding the .001 in a lot of situations. The Auto IK feature used to stop when it found a disconnected parent. Well, not anymore. It can now follow the hierarchy even if that parent has been emancipated. The old motion paths used to create a jagged line when you were adjusting that with the auto update enabled, which kind of made it look broken. This is now being cleaned up. It still can't fix your bad animation. That's on you. The dope sheet has a new operator called Select Keyframes by Type. You can find it in the Select menu or by searching with the F3. And don't forget, you can also open up the Redo panel to edit that operation. This will open up more workflows as you'll be able to easily select those keyframes without spam clicking. It's now possible to select all the markers to the left and the right of the playhead by control clicking in the marker area. Just control click on an empty space either side of the playhead and that's going to select all the markers on that side. You can hold shift to extend that selection. Plus you can still select the camera and the marker by control clicking on that camera marker. So click on the space to select all, click on the markers to select the markers. Objects now have access to the breakdown animation tools. This will make some things much easier to animate. Objects still don't have access to all the animation tools like armatures do, but now they're not so much like second-class citizens. There's a nice improvement to the parent-child selection tool with their square brackets. In the old versions of Blender, it would only work on the active bone. Now in 5.2, it works on all the selected bones. Isn't that nice? There are now more options for how you want the animation to playback or loop when you start the playback. The default is infinite, that's how it's always been, but now you can play it once and have it return to where it was, to the end of the animation or to the start. You can even make it ping pong, which is called bounce. That way you can make it feel like you're undoing all those bad life choices. Zoop. Another playback option is the allow pre-roll. By default, when you start the animation before the start frame, it will snap to the start and then start playing. When you allow pre-roll, it's going to start from where the playhead is. But note, this will not override the allow negative frames option. Speaking of the allow negative frames, this has moved to a sub-panel in the user preferences, and it now shows a warning. Nothing technically has changed, other than now it has a better explanation telling you why it isn't enabled by default. But I like living on the edge, so I'm just going to check that one on. Yeah. Finally, we have a way to mass delete F-curve modifiers. There it is, right under the add F-curve modifiers. You can remove all, remove a specific type, or remove the first one on each of the selected curves. I know this is going to make a lot of people happy because of the many hours they've spent manually deleting these F-curve modifiers. And everyone else will be like, hey, wasn't that there already? No, it wasn't. Now it is. It's now easier than ever to isolate your curves by control clicking on the eyeball icon. This makes it much faster to show what you want to see and hide what you don't. But that's not all. The graph editor now has a local view, just like the 3D viewport. You can press slash to jump into local view for your selected curves. You'll see it say local view up in the corner. And to jump out of local view, just press slash again. The pose library has some added improvements. Previously, when applying a pose that had a different rotation order, say it was stored in Quaternion and then applied to your current file that was set to Euler, this would result in missing data or the wrong orientations. Now Blender will do some magic conversions to try and correct for that. When going from Quaternion or axis angle to an Euler, Blender will find the closest Euler angle that's going to match and use that. When going from an Euler to a Quaternion or an axis angle, it's going to assume that the asset was saved in Euler XYZ, because there isn't actually a way of knowing if that's true or not. And then if you're going from an Euler to an Euler, this will just assume that it was saved in the same rotation order. Because, as I previously said, there's actually no way that Blender can know. So that's not all of them, but that's the main ones. Hopefully this improves your workflow. See ya.
The principled BSDF got a new thin wall checkbox, which, while it might be a small option, is a big deal. It allows you to properly render thin translucency within the material, like light shining through leaves. And for glass, it removes the refraction, which can significantly speed up render times and cut down on noise for light coming through windows. A scene time node was also added, matching the one in geometry nodes. There's also input nodes for Boolean, integer, and vector values. Color spaces are now organized into menus, and there are new ones for reverse transforming Apple, RE, Blackmagic, Canon, and Sony cameras back into linear space, so you can more easily import your footage into Blender and have everything work all together. You can also use Adobe RGB or the various options for wide gamut textures. You can now uncheck the render output for cases where you want to save with the file output node in the compositor instead of from the output panel. Light and shadow linking setups can now be copied from one object to another. For orthographic cameras, the orthographic scale can now be adjusted directly in the 3D view with a widget. Images dragged and dropped into world shaders are now assumed to be environment textures. The AOV output node, which links custom shader data with the compositor, now shows all available AOVs, so you don't have to type in the names manually. Blender's real-time render engine got a handful of great updates in this release. The main one is that screen space ray tracing was overhauled, and the resulting renders are much improved in the details. The highlights include better contact reflections, smoother denoising, significantly more accurate ambient occlusion, and reduced light leaks. There's a new backface slider option that allows you to control whether the screen space global illumination is single-sided, double-sided, or anywhere in between. The 5.1 behavior would be turning this off completely, but it looks much better with it on. The performance section now has an anisotropic filtering option, which is basically a control for how good your textures look at extreme angles. Lights can now be seen directly in the camera if you enable camera ray visibility. In that same panel, you can also control which objects are visible to raycast shader nodes. Scenes with a lot of instancing can now render up to twice as fast. Let me double check that. Yep, twice as fast. Shadow pools up to 2 gigs are now supported for scenes with lots of detailed lights. The limit of 8 attributes per material was removed. Reflection planes are now compatible with refraction, blended transparent materials, and the shader to RGB node. Eevee's principled BSDF shader now supports the clear coat layer normal, and the normal map node base option, which was recently added to Cycles for improving normals on top of displacement, is now available in Eevee as well. There were also tons of bug fixes in this release that removed various small artifacts from edge cases, and the result is just much more clean and stable renders overall. For Cycles, the realistic path tracer, the biggest new feature is texture caching. Generating a texture cache, which is like a set of variable-sized textures that Cycles can choose from depending on how big the texture appears in that specific render, can allow for huge memory savings for scenes with large textures. In the Simplify panel, you can reduce the texture resolution in the viewport to keep it interactive, even if your textures are way too big. The Raycast node can now sample custom attributes like those from geometry nodes wherever the rays hit, though this is just in Cycles for now. Subsurface scattering scale and anisotropy have been tweaked a bit so their values better match other renderers, so you can share textures between them. And last but not least, you can now ban shadows from the world.
Hi, this is Momo from the YouTube channel MomoPTFL, and exciting features in my opinion is that the interactive or traditional compositor now supports animation playback. This means we can finally play image sequences and videos in the compositor and also animate nodes with keyframes while having the ability to preview the outcome. And also, the compositor will now use the GPU by default instead of the CPU, which gives a huge performance boost without having to set it up manually. Another advantage of the interactive compositor has always been the gizmos for certain nodes like the ellipse and box mask. In Blender 5.2, these aren't exclusive to the compositor's backdrop anymore, but can now be viewed and controlled in Blender's image editor. To make sure this feature works like expected, node gizmos will now also be affected by transform offsets. And on top of that, the node gizmos can now also be animated by using the auto keying feature of Blender, which means keyframes will be created automatically when you use the gizmos. But let's move on to some of the new nodes. For example, the new blank image node allows you to create a color solid in a definable resolution. This might not sound like much at first, but it's actually a game changer. For example, if you would just use the alpha over node to add a backdrop by changing the color of the background input, the result would automatically be clipped to the image input you use as the foreground. But by using the new blank image node, you can avoid this clipping behavior and just transform your foreground image without having to worry about clipping. But there's also another pretty cool use case, which is creating a kernel for Blender's convolve node. For example, you can use the image coordinates of a low-resolution blank image for procedural textures and then use that low-resolution texture as a kernel to create something like camera lens blur. Let's move to one of the biggest changes of the compositor, which is the addition of multiple new input socket types you might already know from geometry nodes like integer vectors, matrices, transforms, and much more. Especially useful is that you're able to add object and camera data to the compositor. To add them, you can also just drag and drop the objects from the outliner into the compositor. I want to show you a feature that has been anticipated for a long time. I'm talking about the ability to add text elements right within the compositor. Like, you can just define the font, the text alignment, and the wrapping, type in some text, and you have your text element. And this is also where another of the new input sockets comes into play, which is the string input. By using this new input type and the related utility nodes, you can already create a few effects, like this typewriter effect I've created. The only thing missing currently is being able to transform individual text characters, but you could already work around that by just using multiple string-to-image nodes. And another exciting addition to the compositor are a few new preset assets for the compositor, including the long-awaited film grain effect. It comes with some presets you can choose from by using the menus to keep the inputs at a minimum. But if you want further control, you can also set everything to custom, which will expand several inputs for you to adjust. Next we have Blender's new differing node group, which will reduce the amount of different colors of its input and then use patterns to blend between the limited colors. So basically, you can think of it as a pixel art filter. Again, you can use a menu to choose between different differing patterns, including multiple bi-differing patterns, which is usually the most popular pattern for differing. But we also got a few more complex node groups that utilize the different render passes of Blender to create 3D post-processing effects. For example, the new depth atmosphere, which lets you use a render's mist or depth pass to add fog to your scene. Just keep in mind that the real-time compositor of Blender, which works directly in the 3D viewport, only supports using different render passes when using Eevee. If you're using Cycles, you would have to render the image once and then use the effect in the interactive compositor. This also applies to the new paint filter. Well, at least when deciding to use its tracking feature. If you disable the tracking feature, you just have a simple 2D paint effect. But when enabling the tracking and using the depth and position render passes, the paint effect will be applied with depth, which makes it easier to keep different objects in your scene apart. Again, you can choose between different presets here, like watercolor and oil paint, and also just a paper texture overlay. Another effect, which you can use both in a 2D and a 3D version, is the night vision node group. As the name suggests, it will add this popular green night vision effect to your footage. We also got a few new node groups that already make use of the new inputs and nodes of Blender 5.2. By using these, you can generate texture coordinates from the camera in your 3D viewport, which means you can create a procedural background in the compositor and make it automatically adjust itself to the position and rotation of the camera. The VSE also got some pretty cool new features to strengthen its integration of the compositor. For starters, the VSE will now use the GPU for compositing, which again gives a huge performance boost. And compositing node groups and assets can now instantly be added as a modifier on a VSE strip. There are just two conditions the compositor assets have to meet. The first input of the node group has to be the image input, and the .blend file of the assets has to be saved in Blender 5.2. For my own compositing pack mpcomp, I've made sure to update all nodes to have the image input at the top for this exact reason in the latest update of it. This new integration of compositing modifiers in the VSE also allows us to easily add transitions to clips. For example, by using one of the transitions from a pack, you just add the modifier to the first clip, place the clip it should transition to below it in the timeline, and then select it as a mask in the compositor modifier. Apart from the new input types, you can also use a default input type now. This basically enables you to create a node group with an input for the animation time, which, if the user doesn't connect anything to, will automatically use the scene time. So essentially, you can make an input entirely optional now. We also got the warning node in the compositor now, which you can use to display error messages or warnings if a certain condition is met. And to create even better performing node setups, you can now see the total processing time of the compositor when enabling the timings overlay right above the group output node. Let's get to some of the smaller but cool new features and changes. For example, when using the grease pencil in Eevee, you now get the correct depth of the grease pencil object in the render's depth pass. Previously, grease pencil objects have just been ignored by it. So again, a feature that increases the 2.5D capabilities of Blender and its compositor. When using the transform node in Blender's compositor to scale something down, you can now also set it to use the anisotropic interpolation, which gives a lot smoother looking result. And last but not least, the stabilize 2D node, which is used to apply tracked stabilization to your footage, now received a frame input. This allows you to alter the timing of the stabilization, which can come in handy when using fast forward or pausing effects for footage in the compositor, so the stabilization stays in sync. Well, these were all the new features of Blender 5.2 for the compositor. I sure think it's very exciting.
In the video sequence editor, frame prefetching now fetches a few frames before the playhead to make scrubbing backwards a little bit smoother. Footage playback is now significantly faster for those who are still using OpenGL. Extra timecode files are no longer needed when building or using proxies, so there's now less bloat in your file browser. Text strips now support custom line spacing and have style presets that you can customize. Solid color strips can now have exact pixel dimensions. And speaking of strips, the thumbnails are now shown only at the start and end for better performance, but you can change it to display across the whole strip if you'd like. You can now select specific view layers for scene strips and change the viewport shading for all of them at once. The color scopes now fully support HDR and wide gamut color spaces, which is also now true in the image editor. The preview area can now show composition guides. There's a new optional scrubbing region that can be added to the playback controls footer. Strip image origins now have more snapping options. Importing videos now supports an unlimited number of video and audio channels. In the motion tracking department, masks have a new move to layer operator that has the hotkey M by default, just like moving to collections in the 3D view. Plus, masks are now rendered about 10% faster. Blender in virtual reality, using the built-in VR scene inspection add-on, has a new feature called location scouting, which gives you a camera with all the proper camera controls, which you can use to plan out angles and shots. So you can now scan a live film location and spend as much time as you want later planning out exactly how it should be shot without having to actually be there. Not quite teleportation, but the next best thing. Blender now natively supports online asset libraries. If you allow online connections, which, by the way, is always disabled by default for privacy and security, you'll see that the Essentials library that comes with Blender is much larger now. You get new base meshes, compositing setups, and helpful geometry node groups, as well as the high-res versions of the viewport HDRIs. Top-level categories named compositing or geometry nodes are now ignored in the node menus, making organization a lot easier. You can now specify a preferred import method per asset. Asset libraries now have their own page in the Preferences editor, and the built-in Essentials is now in that list. The time it takes Blender to write 16-bit EXR images has been cut in half. There's a new option in the right-click context menu for render dimensions to swap the X and Y. Stereoscopic and panoramic metadata is now written for movies, so you can upload these types of renders straight to YouTube or any other platform without having to pass them through any other software. For importing and exporting, the color spaces are now respected when importing USD files, and there's a new USD export option for how frequently to flush the data, so you can reduce memory usage. The GLTF file format got a huge number of improvements as usual, from general fixes and performance enhancements to support for point clouds, iridescence, and dispersion materials, and KHR primitives, which can be used for Gaussian splats. Alembic imports now respect animated object visibility, F-curves for camera data, and subdivision surface data. During STL export, you can now choose whether the new file follows the viewport or the render settings of the modifiers, similar to how you can with the other formats. The outliner now automatically scrolls to the active object by default, which is amazing, but you can turn this off if you want to. In the reorganized drop-down menu here, that no longer has the filter icon. Shape keys are now listed in the outliner. Aligned editor edges no longer snap together by default because they could get annoyingly stuck together, but you can still move them together by holding Shift. Nested lists, like those for bone collections, now have auto scroll for dragging and dropping. You can also reverse the sorting of these lists, invert the search filtering, use the arrow keys to navigate, and use the number pad period to jump to selected. This all also works in the asset shelf. There's a new filled filtering icon that's used wherever filtering is active, and there are new download icons to go with the new online assets system. The set parent menu, Control P, now has icons for the parenting types. Sidebar tabs have a compact view option now, which supports showing an icon, though that's not used anywhere in Blender right now, so it's not too useful as of yet. But you can also now switch between tabs with clicking and dragging like other areas of Blender. There's a new text box input type that allows multi-line text inputs. Long menus and popovers can now be panned using the middle mouse button, and some popovers now have subpanels that can be collapsed. Hexadecimal values can now be copy and pasted directly into color inputs. You don't even have to open it up, just Control V. Number inputs no longer have the unit as part of the text, and instead it's just rendered as a hint, so it won't get in the way while you're typing. For developers with developer extras enabled, hovering over icons now gives you the icon's ID name. For users with mice with lots of buttons, mouse button 4 is now zoomed to selected by default. For users with Apple's Magic Mouse, Y. Over in the node editor, you can now change properties for multiple node group inputs by holding Alt. Grouping and ungrouping in node editors now avoids creating duplicate outputs and is better at guessing input and output socket types. Ungrouping now adds constants as the previous inputs, so that all the data is saved when you ungroup. Linked groups were moved to a submenu in the Add menu, so they don't crowd out your groups from the current file. And this menu no longer shows linked groups that are only used as subgroups, so it just shows the top level groups. Multiple nodes can now be resized at the same time. The plus button to add a new socket is now used on all nodes that support dynamic numbers of sockets. You can also rename group inputs by control-clicking on the node itself. There are new type conversion nodes for forcing sockets to be a specific data type. Vector input nodes now support 2D and 4D vectors, and menus got their own input node as well. Floats, integers, and vectors now all support the pixel subtype. There is now a theme brightness slider for the 3D view's access colors, and the theme editor was reorganized a bit overall. And last but not least, Blender on Mac has a very slick new icon that I will definitely be ripping to use on Linux, but on Mac it also automatically supports the transparent liquid glass styles as well. That, along with hundreds of bug fixes, is what's new in Blender 5.2 LTS. You can download it today from blender.org, and don't forget to support the development fund while you're there to help make future updates even better. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and as always, happy blending.